Thanks, Diane, and your colleagues at ANS for inviting me to come and be part of this program. And I've put together a new talk, so this is the test run for it. We'll see how it works, but it really is a combination of several things that have always been of interest to me. Certainly, it's the tail end of spring and spring migration, and the neotropical migrant birds we've been seeing are a highlight of every year for me at this time of year. But I've never wanted to just put a name on the bird. I've always wanted to understand a little bit about how they live, and not just the what, but the why in nature. And I think that's true for many of you that I know, and I think the ANS approach to education has always been a lot more than just putting a name on things, but understanding. So that's what we're going to try and do with this talk tonight. And let's see if the buttons are working. There we go. Okay. Neotropical migrants, the habitat connection is the name of the talk. And we want to start off with defining a few things, what it is we are talking about. The neo part of neotropical refers to the New World, or North and South America. The paleotropics would be the tropical areas in Africa, Asia, and Australasia. Tropical, in the geographical definition, is the area of the Earth between the two tropic lines, which are about 23.5 degrees north and south of the equator. So here's an old globe, and you can see the Tropic of Cancer in the northern hemisphere, the Tropic of Capricorn in the south. So that's the neotropics we're seeing here. From a biological point of view, we refer to tropical areas as areas without freezing temperatures at any point in the year. And the geographic and biological tropical areas are pretty close to the same. There are areas beyond the tropic lines that don't have freezing weather. And of course, high mountains within the geographic tropics have cold weather. There's snow-capped peaks on the equator in Ecuador. But generally, those two definitions match up. So there's one other place you might run into the term neotropics. And in some categorizations of the major biomes of Earth, neotropics is used for everything from Mexico south all the way to Tierra del Fuego into very temperate areas of South America. That's not the definition I'm using tonight. Now, neotropical migrants, which is a subject, are creatures that regularly move to and from the neotropics into other parts of the globe. And neotropical migrants include a number of insects and bats and birds. But the term is usually used in reference to songbirds that are migrating to and from tropical America. And my focus today is indeed going to be on songbirds. And that brings up the question, why do they migrate? Why are they coming and going, sometimes flying thousands of miles twice a year? And many of us were told when we were kids that our birds go south for the winter because it's getting cold. Well, it's not temperature, really. Birds are able to stay warm as long as they have plenty to eat. A byproduct of digestion is heat, and birds are wearing down jackets. They're well insulated. So it's not the temperatures directly that are causing migration, but it's the availability of food. And we believe almost all of these neotropical migrant songbirds are birds that evolved initially in tropical areas, and they leave the tropics to come up to the temperate zone, or in some cases actually beyond the temperate zone to the Arctic, for greater nesting success. Why is it better to nest for many birds up in the temperate zone? The tropics have, per unit area, more predators, parasites, diseases, and competitors. the temperate zones have cyclical explosions of food resources through our seasonality. Right now, in the salt marshes up here in southern New Jersey, we have an explosion of biting flies and biting little midges we call no-see-ums, and mosquitoes. All those wonderful things on the coast in early summer, they're all bird food. And of course, there's more hours of daylight during the temperate summer. If you're a diurnal creature, which our songbirds pretty much exclusively are, that's more hours to feed yourself and, of course, to feed your young, because birds need probably 3 or 4 times as much food per day when they're feeding young as just to feed themselves. And of course, in the tropical zones, daylight hours change very little from one season to another. So they've got the bonus hours. And of course, there's more land in the neo-temperate region of North America than in the tropics. You just look at the map and North America really spreads out, covers a great distance from east to west in the temperate and Arctic zones. Depending on how you categorize it, there's around 200 species of neotropical migrant birds. And each one has a unique niche. We wouldn't have different species if they had the exact same habitat, the exact same requirements, the exact same food and feeding strategies. And that's one of the things we're going to be looking at tonight. Habitat's an important component of niche, but not the only one. And so we're going to look at some of these birds and their habitats and their ways of living. Why is this important? Well, if you're interested in birds and looking for birds, knowing the right habitats to look for certain birds is helpful. But if you're interested in just understanding some of the wonders of this planet, why we have such diversity, so many different species, I think it's fun to just understand a little bit about their different niches. And I'll add, not every component of a niche for every species is well understood. So if you're looking for a PhD topic, I've got some ideas for you tonight. And we're going to focus on birds that are found in eastern North America. There's certainly a number of neotropical migrants who reside during the breeding season in the western US, but I don't want to keep you up till midnight, so we're narrowing the focus to the things that are in our part of the world. And credit here, I received permission from Cornell Lab of Ornithology's Birds of the World, an incredible reference, to use their range maps and a couple of photos that I didn't have good shots of, Canada warbler and yellow-bellied flycatcher. So that's courtesy of the Cornell Lab of Ornithology's Birds of the World online resource. It's a subscription resource, constantly updated. It had until recently been Birds of North America, but they've expanded it now to the entire world. It's an amazing resource. It's a dangerous rabbit hole. You start getting in there and you find so much information. And indeed, it's one of the major sources of information I used in putting together this program. All right, finally, some birds. Some neotropical migrant songbirds have very wide ranges when they come up into the temperate zone of North America. This is the yellow warbler, and the orangey color on the map is their breeding range. That's a very, very extensive range. Obviously, there's going to be a number of habitats that they can inhabit, an adaptable bird, but there is a common thread to almost all the places where yellow warblers are breeding, and that's the presence of willow. Willows are a diverse group of plants, of woody plants. This is up in the tundra where of Alaska, where the willows are very small. The yellow warblers are there. Across the street from where we live, there's an area with a couple of big black willow trees. The yellow warblers are there. They're almost always tied to willow trees. So there's a connection for you, at least at nesting time. Obviously, in migration, you stop wherever you can. Another neotropical migrant with a very, very extensive range is the common yellowthroat. And here you see that this is a little bit of a fudge to call it a neotropical migrant, because quite a few of them do winter in the temperate zone of the southeast, but many of them do indeed go into tropical areas. And what is it the common yellowthroat finds in this broad range of habitats where it is able to nest? Dense, low brush. I think many of you are familiar with common yellowthroats, and to nest, they just need dense vegetation. It can be marshy, it can be swampy, it can be upland, dry, field edges. A very successful bird, but their niche requires that for nesting. On the other extreme is a specialist bird like the Kirtland's warbler. This bird's nesting habitat is restricted to a very small area in the Upper Great Lakes region where there are forests of jack pine between 5 and 15 years old. Now, this is a range map from probably 20 years ago, just an area of the upper part of the lower peninsula of Michigan. But as biologists sorted out some of the habitat needs for this bird, some of the other issues involving cowbird parasitism, agricultural chemicals, things like that, some habitat modifications were done in different regions. And this is a conservation success story. Here's the sort of young jack pine forest that the Kirtland's warblers like. And here is the current range map. They've expanded their breeding territory into the upper peninsula of Michigan, into Wisconsin, real close to the Wisconsin-Minnesota line. They're almost to Duluth, and a little spot over in Ontario as well. But this is a case of a species with a very limited habitat for breeding, and by managing for that habitat, we've been able to see the numbers of those birds come up. You'll see they winter exclusively in the Bahamas as well. And we're still waiting for our first migrant Kirtland's warbler to be spotted in Cape May. We're hopeful every year, every spring and fall, but hasn't happened yet. Talking about pines, the pine warbler is one that is less picky about its pines, but wait a second, we look at the range map for the pine warbler and it's not a neotropical migrant at all. They completely winter in the southeastern part of the US, so we're gonna wipe out the pine warbler. It does not count as a neotropical migrant, even though they're a wonderful bird. So we're going to jump now to a region, a major biome of North America where lots of neotropical migrant songbirds are going. And that's the boreal forest of the northern part of the temperate zone in Canada and Alaska. And the boreal forest where it is mature, as in this photo, is big old spruces and firs. But there's always a mix of habitats. Up in the boreal forest, lots of breaks for lakes and ponds. Much of this is remnant from the relatively recent, in geologic terms, ice age. And of course, beavers are very active up there too to maintain lots of wetlands. And it's an area where wildfires naturally occur, other situations, one of which we'll talk about in a few minutes, where the mature forest is knocked back down. The boreal forest has more diversity than a lot of people think, with mature forest, young forest, marshy areas, deep water ponds. But it's a great place for birds because it does have real explosions of insects in the spring, a prolonged winter, and long daylight hours in the summer. So I'm going to do this several times tonight. I'm going to show you a number of range maps, and if you want to quiz yourself, you can try and figure out what some of the birds are. But the point of these 6 maps together is all of these are birds whose nesting area is restricted to the boreal forests of extreme northern US and Canada, a little bit different areas, but these are ones that you've got to go to the north to find them nesting. And we'll name them, see how well you did if you guessed what any of them were. And I'm going to have to look at my notes a little bit as we go to make sure all the specifics I've got straight. The first of these boreal nesting birds we're going to look at is the palm warbler. And this is a bird likes the edges of those areas where the mature boreal spruce fir forest bets up against open areas. It can be around some of those lakes or marshes, or at the edges of clearings where fire or other natural disturbance has occurred. There's two subspecies of palm warbler. This is the eastern or yellow race in its breeding plumage. And here with the yellow much more restricted, just under the tail, under the throat, a little bit on the face, is the western race of palm warbler. And there are intergrades, which is why they're not different species. And if you go birding a fair bit, you probably see a lot more of the western palms than the eastern palms, because I put a line up approximately, that black line on the map is showing the division between where the western palm and the eastern palm warblers nest. There's a lot more territory for the western ones. Probably 80 to 90% of the territory is inhabited by the western form. When migration comes, though, it's pretty interesting, because the eastern palms, the yellow palm warblers, tend to head to the Gulf Coast and over towards Texas to spend the winter, whereas the western ones are heading more towards Florida and the Caribbean, and a little bit, there aren't many birds on the eastern edge of Central America. They're mostly Caribbean wintering birds. But it's kind of interesting that these two populations cross in migration. Little tidbit for you. The next boreal nesting species I want to bring up is the Philadelphia vireo. Like all vireos, it's got a heavier bill than a warbler, a little hook at the end. When I first started birding a couple hundred years ago, vireos were considered close relatives of the warblers because, you know, they're fairly small and colorful. Recent work has shown they're much more closely related to flycatchers and shrikes, the little hook on the end of the bill. And if you watch a tree that might have a warbler and a vireo feeding, they've got very different feeding strategies. Warblers are typically picking up a lot of bugs, and typically they're mostly getting crawling bugs, little caterpillars, and other larval forms of insects. But the vireos are going after bigger ones. So they're going to be a little less frenetic in their behavior, and they'll often grab a caterpillar, a big one, get it on that hook at the end of the bill and pound it on the twig. So there's a case where two different kinds of birds may be inhabiting the same tree and the same habitat, but they're going for different food resources. Yet another feeding strategy is that of the flycatchers. And this is the boreal nesting yellow-bellied flycatcher, one of the near look-alike Empidonax flycatchers that drive many birders crazy when they're silent. Their calls are very distinctive. But like other flycatchers, the yellow-bellied flycatcher doesn't just catch flies, it catches insects when they are flying, as opposed to the crawling insects that the warblers and vireos are mostly after. And many of you, I'm sure, have watched flycatchers at work. They'll sit on a perch watching around, and they see something that looks tasty fly by, and they too will then fly out, grab it, and go sit down again, often in the very same perch. And so they're inhabiting the same habitat as some of the warblers and vireos. This bird has a different food resource it's taking advantage of and a different feeding strategy. Now, the other three species that I showed on that initial set of 6 maps are all birds, are all warblers that are feeding mostly on the crawling insects in the conifer trees, the spruces and the firs. This is the Tennessee warbler, and it's typically feeding high in the canopy of the spruces and firs. And it's very active feeder. It's flitting around a lot. Next, the bay-breasted warbler in the same trees is more likely to be in the mid-level of the tree and towards the center of the tree. That's where it seems to be best adapted to find its crawling insects. Whereas the third maybe even in the same tree, is the Cape May warbler. And they tend to feed on the outer edges of the trees and will actually do some fly catching themselves, darting out and catching insects. So in this way, it's known as resource partitioning. Three species of warblers, and sometimes others as well, that can be in the very same tree. Each has their own way of feeding, their own preferred part of the tree, and they can coexist quite well. By the way, these last three species, the Tennessee warbler, the bay-breasted warbler, and the Cape May warbler, are all birds that have cyclical populations that cycle along with a naturally occurring insect called the spruce budworm. This is a moth whose larva feeds on the needles of spruce trees up in the boreal forest. And I will go, I'm debating whether to do this little aside or not. Boreal and Arctic habitats tend to have lower diversity than temperate and tropical areas. And in lower diversity, you tend to get more cyclical populations. And this is, again, a native species. And every 30 to 40 years, it seems to reach a peak. And as it does, a couple things happen. In its abundance, the birds that really are well adapted to feed on it, these three warblers we've talked about, their populations go up. And also a number of trees are killed, and we end up with more breaks in the forest, a lot more edges, and a more diverse habitat up in the boreal forest zone. So we are currently experiencing a peak in the spruce budworms up in Quebec, Canada, and that means a lot of Tennessee warblers, bay-breasted warbler, Cape May warblers that are going to breed up there are having high breeding success. Their populations are up, and many of them migrate through the mid-Atlantic. If you're a birder and you were out birding the last couple of springs, or actually the falls as well, you probably saw more Tennessee, bay-breasted, and Cape May warblers than you were seeing 5 and 10 years ago. So that's kind of fun. I'm about 40 years into my birding career, and so I'm catching the second peak on these species now. And after a lot of years, when I went a number of years not seeing a single bay-breasted warbler in the spring migration. And as spruce specialists, when they migrate through the mid-Atlantic, more often than not, I'll find one of these migrant birds in one of the spruce trees that's around here, even these non-native Norway spruces that are planted around. That's by far and away the best place to find Cape May warblers in the spring when they're migrating through. They are drawn to that spruce habitat. And another spruce nesting species that I'll find in the spruces is the blackpoll warbler. This is a female, quite different from the male. And the blackpoll warbler has a very wide range in the boreal forest. It extends much further north than many boreal forest nesting birds, really up to the tree line, the stunted trees of the area we sometimes call the taiga, where the boreal forest is transitioning into the tundra. And it's a fascinating range map. The blackpoll warbler common in Alaska, but as far as we know, they pretty much all migrate east across Canada and then down through the US, and they all launch off the Atlantic coastline in what is sometimes a multiple day and night single flight down to South America, a remarkable migration from blackpoll warblers. There are a number of boreal forest nesting species whose ranges extend down into the Appalachian Mountains, where spruce and fir trees occur. Some in relatively thick populations. You look at the range map here for the Blackburnian warbler, and indeed through the mountains of the mid-Atlantic all the way down to the Great Smokies. Blackburnian warbler is relatively common. And then here's one where it's not quite so abundant in the mountains, doesn't get quite as far south. That's the magnolia warbler. But when we go out to the highlands of West Virginia, it's a nesting species we see there. The next one, kind of an interesting distribution in the mountains, not much up in Pennsylvania and through the mid-Atlantic, and then a big wide area down in the Great Smoky Mountains. And that's the range of the Canada warbler. We're going to look at all these and talk about why we might find more of these birds in some areas than others. And this is an interesting one. You see the breeding range up in the boreal areas and northern US, and there's like one little spot there in West Virginia. It's kind of hard to see. And that's the mourning warbler, its breeding territory. And then I've got a couple more I want to pop up whose territories include areas in the western US. It's unusual for our neotropical songbirds to have breeding areas both in the eastern and western part of the US. We did see that earlier with the yellow warbler and the common yellowthroat, and here the Nashville warbler and the northern water thrush. So yes, Blackburnian warbler, boy, beautiful birds. You just love to get a great look like this, but you usually don't because they're in the top of the conifer trees, the spruce and the fir, and they generally like the bigger trees, so they drive you crazy up there. But once you get a good look, it's unforgettable. Magnolia warbler, a lot easier to get a good look at. It prefers the conifers and is going to be in at least mixed forest, if not solid conifers, but it's usually in the mid-levels where it's a little easier to get a good look at. They also sing their heads off. Canada warbler is down even lower, areas of dense understory. And in fact, an area like this in the mid-Atlantic mountains with dense rhododendron understory, that seems to be where I always find Canada warblers breeding in places like Garrett County, Maryland, and West Virginia. The mourning warbler likes the edges of the woods, brushy edges near openings. Years ago on an ANS trip, we found an area I've gone back to many times on the Highland Scenic Highway in West Virginia near Marlinton, where at the overlook number 4 in the brushy area below the overlook that they keep clear so that it's a good view right at the edge of the woods, that's a good mourning warbler habitat. The Nashville warbler also usually forages low, and it really likes a mixture of conifer and deciduous habitat. It's a very small warbler with a little bill, and it may be picking smaller bugs than some of the other warblers that are in the similar habitat. And the northern water thrush, true to its name, likes to be near water. Those big open ponds and marshes of the boreal forest are areas where it nests. To the best of my knowledge, the southernmost nesting location that's known for northern water thrushes is the Cranberry Glades in West Virginia. Now, it's got a cousin that occurs in the south, the Louisiana water thrush, and that, of course, breeds around the Washington, D.C. area and throughout the mid-Atlantic and further south. If you're not good at your water thrush ID, the Louisiana water thrush has the clean white throat and a bolder, pure white eye line that flares wider behind the eye. And generally more pure white on the underparts with the dark streaks against it. Louisiana water thrushes nest along fast-flowing streams. They nest on the ground, often under overhanging moss in the little ravines where our streams flow. Now, when I first started going to Costa Rica, I noticed on the bird list that both northern and Louisiana water thrushes occurred there. So I said, okay, Louisiana water thrush from further south, it's going to be in the lowlands. Northern water thrush from further north, it's going to be in the highlands. Well, I was wrong. It's the reverse, because it's not temperature that matters, it's habitat. And in the mountains of Costa Rica, where the water is fast flowing, that's where the Louisiana water thrush found the habitat it likes. And the northern was down at sea level in mangroves or other low wet coastal areas where the water was still, reminiscent of the still waters of its nesting habitat. So that was a good lesson I learned, that the habitat matters more than the temperature. All right, here's another set of unlabeled maps for you to guess at. These are all birds of the southeastern United States, where often there's a lot of pines and hardwoods mixed, little different extensions, but it's another major biome where there are a lot of neotropical migrants nesting. And see if you guessed any of them correctly, the ranges of them. And before we get into looking at this group of 6, I'm going to make 4 of them disappear because notice in these 2 species, the yellow-throated warbler and the Swainson's warbler, they sort of have ranges that extend north in 2 different places, coastally and up through the mountains or just west of the mountains. We'll talk about why that is in a little bit, but you might guess it has something to do with habitat. So here's a picture from the southeast where you'll have stands of pine. This is a fairly open area. You'll have mixed pines and hardwoods. Very often, because of human lumbering and other activities, but also under natural conditions, this is prone to wildfires. You have lots of breaks in the habitat, lots of open areas, lots of edges that many birds take advantage of. So of the southeastern birds, the prothonotary warbler has long been one of my favorites. I bet some of you are nodding your heads in agreement as I say that. Originally called the golden swamp warbler 200 years ago. And indeed, this has a unique habit. It inhabits the swampy areas, which of course are quite common in the southeast. When we did our trips to the Great Dismal Swamp every spring, the number of prothonotary warblers we found there was pretty remarkable. And it's not a rare bird. In the right habitat, in swampy forest, you're going to find prothonotary warblers in the southeastern quadrant of the US. And it is our only eastern cavity nesting warbler. They nest in hollow trees that have their base surrounded by water. And they will take to nesting boxes as well. The Kentucky warbler is a bird more of the dense understory of mature deciduous forests or mixed deciduous and pine. And this is a species that's in decline because throughout much of the southeastern US, we have an overpopulation of deer, which is reducing the understory, which is their nesting habitat. So still on some of the ridges through the mid-Atlantic and other areas where the forest still has a dense understory, there are good numbers of Kentucky warblers. But they are always down low. You're never going to find a Kentucky warbler up in a treetop. Well, never say never. It would be a very big surprise to find one up there. Now, yellow-throated warbler. I pointed out that its range extends a little further north near the Atlantic coast and then further inland. And that's because there are 2 races of the yellow-throated warbler that have different habitat needs. The eastern population, known as the yellow lord, you might see a little bit of yellow in front of the eye on that white stripe, is usually found around tall pines. They prefer to feed up high in the pines, and they'll do a bit of creeping on trunks and branches even. You can see for a warbler, it's got a fairly large bill, and they will probe in areas like that to get insects. Whereas inland, they're known as the white lord form. That white eye stripe leading over to the area known as the lores, the area between the eye and the bill, is pure white. And these are the birds that you're going to see on the C&O Canal that really love the sycamore trees and big tall shade trees in riparian areas. Now, the Swainson's warbler is an interesting case. This is a skulking bird. You know, so many warblers are colorful, and this one is quite drably colored. It uses its big ringing voice, not its appearance, in courtship, and they stay in dense cover. It reminds me a number of tropical birds that are always under dense cover. But it finds dense cover in 2 different habitats, depending on whether it's along the coast or inland. Along the coast, and I don't have a picture of this habitat, the big cane breaks, switch cane, which grows to be 7 and 8 feet tall in dense stands in the swamps of the southeastern coastal plain, is where you find Swainson's warblers. But inland, it's usually in the dense vegetation along streams up in the mountains. This is an area that had a nesting pair of Swainson's warblers in southern West Virginia. I left the Acadian flycatcher out of my notes, but in the southeast, of course, there is a little Empidonax flycatcher here as well that is going to have that different behavior, feeding on flying insects and not so much the crawling ones that the other neotropical migrants are specializing in. And then the worm-eating warbler is a bird of deciduous woods. Usually there's a lot of oak trees around where worm-eating warblers are. By the way, it doesn't eat earthworms. It's eating caterpillars, which are known as worms, which almost all warblers are eating. So it's a terrible name. Yeah, it's appropriate, but it's not distinctive that they are worm-eating. And this bird specializes in hanging clusters of leaves. Excuse me, often there's been some sort of an insect infestation, a branch breaks off. Probably we'll see these go up after next year when the periodical cicadas will be back in the DC area. That's right, 2021 for the periodical cicadas, and they'll snap off a number of branches which will dangle, and the next year will have dead leaves in them. That will be great habitat for microhabitat, you might say, for the worm-eating warbler. There are a couple birds of the southeast that extend into the southwest as well. And go ahead, this is the guessing game again. You can try and guess what these two species are. The blue grosbeak and the summer tanager. And of course, these are both bigger birds with heavier bills that are going to eat seeds in the case of the grosbeak, or fruits in the case of the summer tanager later in the season. But most seed or fruit eating birds are going to switch to a lot of insects in the spring for more protein to help nourish their young. Now we're going to get to sort of the northeastern habitat, the Great Eastern Deciduous Forest biome. Lots of nesting birds here, lots of neotropical migrants. And the one we're going to look at first here is one, again, most of our neotropical migrants are not going to go all the way into South America. The majority of them are wintering in Central America or the Caribbean basin. But this one going all the way to South America. Anybody know what it is? It's the scarlet tanager. And our eastern deciduous forest has the mountains as well as the Piedmont, some of the lower coastal plain, the Ohio Valley, extending up into the Great Lakes region. Lots and lots of beautiful forest habitat. Little bit different species composition in different areas depending on elevation and rainfall and how long since disturbance, but it is a large biome. It is the largest chunk of deciduous forest anywhere in the world. And especially when these trees are just leafing out in the spring, they are heaven to little insects. They're most tender when they're just coming out. They haven't had a chance to develop some of the deterring chemicals. And you look at leaves in end of April, beginning of May on an oak tree when it's just coming out, and you'll find all sorts of critters, big bugs, small bugs. It's no wonder the birds are coming right then. And we always want all the songbirds to show up before the trees have leafed out, but the food's not going to be there. So they tend to have it timed pretty well. And there's a whole bunch of birds that we'll see a lot of their nesting habitat is in this great eastern deciduous forest biome with variability, some extending down into the southeast, some stretching north into the boreal, some heading out into the west. But for all of these species, the eastern deciduous forest biome is their primary habitat. And they're eating bugs. And here, our smallest warbler, the northern parula, or parula, if you'd rather pronounce it that way, is generally finding small bugs up in the treetops. This one found a tenoral damselfly, a young damselfly, and it looks like it's not quite sure what to do with a bug that big. More likely catching the big bugs are the vireos, and here is our widespread red-eyed vireo, one of the most common birds of the eastern deciduous forest biome, and very vocal all summer long. If you're even a casual birder that goes out in the woods around Washington, you know the song of the red-eyed vireo. And the yellow-billed cuckoo is another neotropical migrant that breeds primarily in the eastern deciduous forest biome. And while they will feed on all sorts of caterpillars, and they are specialized for bigger caterpillars, they are especially fond of the tent caterpillars, which are native and cyclical. And most areas it's on about a 10-year cycle. And if you've got a year or two with lots and lots of tent caterpillars, you're probably going to be encountering yellow-billed cuckoos more frequently. And of course, the tent caterpillars especially love black cherry trees. So there's another connection. Indigo bunting is another eastern deciduous forest specialist, and it really likes the edges. It'll be up in taller trees right at the edge of a field or an opening. Used to be several of them nesting at wood end. I imagine they still are. And because the open fields with the big trees around it is just perfect for indigo buntings. And the way our eastern deciduous forest biome is broken up so much, indigo buntings are thriving and quite common. And of course, it's in the finch family. It's got that seed cracking bill, but as we said before, most seed eating birds will switch to lots of insects in the spring for the protein for raising young. The ovenbird, another bird tied to the eastern deciduous forest, but this one's a ground feeder. It nests on the ground, it forages on the ground. About the only time it gets up off of the ground is to get to a song perch, when they can go up to 15 or 20 feet in a tree, but rarely much higher than that. And a hooded warbler. Hooded warblers are usually found in areas with fairly mature eastern deciduous forest. You need some fairly big trees, even though this is a bird of the understory. That's the habitat it likes. And kind of like the Kentucky warbler, if the understory is too cleared out, either intentionally by human activity or unintentionally because of an overpopulation of deer, the hooded warbler suffers. Now, grasslands and shrubby field habitat are another habitat for a good variety of neotropical migrant songbirds. And I'm going to skip the maps at the beginning here, just looking at this type of habitat. It can be low scrubby brush, or it can be grasses. And that brushy area of the second habitat photo is the ideal habitat for the prairie warbler. Beautiful prairie habitat, a prairie warbler, not really prairie habitat if you think of big mature grasslands as prairies, but as scrubby areas where it forages on, again, mostly crawling insects. They're a very busy bird. If you're around prairie warblers, they're not going to sit still for you very often. I was lucky to grab that shot. The orchard oriole is an interesting one. It can occur in big shade trees by rivers and creeks, but they thrive in scrubby areas, maybe with trees coming in succession, just 5 or 10 years old. Orchard orioles will thrive in that habitat. Orioles are in the blackbird family. They've got a multi-purpose bill. It's thick enough to crack some seeds and fruit, but long and skinny enough to pick bugs out of crevices and such. So they're a true omnivore. the willow flycatcher, I think that's, yeah, willow fly, I got to check my notes on these Amphidonax flycatchers to make sure I've got the right one. The willow flycatcher likes these scrubby areas, but usually near water. So low, brushy area with water nearby, generally, but not exclusively within the eastern deciduous forest biome. You can see on the range map here, willow flycatchers occur all the way out to the west coast. So while they thrive in the right habitat of the eastern deciduous, even in the western US where you've got dense scrubby vegetation around water, you've got the possibility of willow flycatchers. The blue-winged warbler, I guess you had to call this bright yellow bird something other than yellow because so many warblers have yellow. The blue-winged warbler it thrives in really dense second growth, maybe 5, 10, 15-year-old forest coming in after a clearing where the trees are really close together, the young trees, the saplings, and still fairly open country. And I mentioned before, it's real easy to say what the habitat is. Exactly why the blue-winged has an advantage in that habitat and not in another is very hard to pinpoint. This is one of those things that if you define very, very specifically all of the parameters that define the range of a species of bird, you get a PhD for that for sure. Yellow-breasted chat. This is interesting. When I started birding, they had this in the warblers, but it never looked much like a warbler. It's fairly big. It is now classified in its own family, the Ithomyidae. It is an interesting bird that, again, likes this real brushy, scrubby habitat, edges of woods, mostly in the southeastern US, coming up a little north of us here. With that heavier bill, again, it's mostly an insect eater, but like a vireo, it's able to behave rather sluggishly, kind of lay in wait until it sees the big caterpillars and go after them. And it's another one with a very wide range. Eastern kingbirds, a flycatcher of the open country. They'll be on edges, but they'll also perch on just a little stump out in the middle of a grassland or a field where they, at this time of year, the breeding season, they live up to their scientific name, which is Tyrannus tyrannus. And they're sometimes known, the entire group, as the tyrant flycatchers, because it'll chase after anything that's coming close to its nest. We've got an area near here that I've been walking at recently with some nesting kingbirds, and I've seen them chasing vultures, I've seen them chasing egrets, I've seen them chasing crows and mockingbirds and red-winged blackbirds, about anything. And one of the interesting things about the eastern kingbird is they migrate all the way down to South America, and they form flocks, especially in the fall migration. We see here in Cape May sometimes 50 to 100 eastern kingbirds in a field together, always the last week of August. And my friends in Costa Rica talk about seeing hundreds and hundreds of them passing by in just a few minutes, especially along the Caribbean coast. A true grassland neotropical migrant is the bobolink, another cousin to the blackbirds like the orioles, it is feeding on spiders and little crawling insects at the base of the grassland in the breeding time. And as the season progresses, they'll switch to the seeds as those grasses go to seed. And we're going to look at the maps for both the bobolink and the eastern kingbird because they are two of our neotropical migrants that go well south into South America for wintering grounds. The bobolink is heading basically to the grasslands of the Pantanal and the Pampas of Argentina. That prairie warbler, we're bringing it back again. Why did I bring it back again? To contrast its migration, that it mostly just ends up in the Caribbean. So a whole other talk could be done with much more of a focus on the wintering territories of these birds. You know, when I first started birding, the wintering behavior of these neotropical migrants wasn't very well known, but a lot of work has been done on that. The late Russ Greenberg from the Smithsonian Migratory Bird Center did some real pioneering work on that. And then just sort of jump around a number of our other neotropical migrant birds we'll just look at real quickly and see some of the different ways that they live. The great crested flycatcher, deciduous forest nesters, and our only cavity nesting flycatcher. The black and white warbler, familiar to many birders, behaving almost nuthatch-like, creeping around on trunks and with that long skinny bill, able to pick insects out of the crevices in the tree bark. The chestnut-sided warbler likes older second growth deciduous forest. They're all over the edges of the forest at the overlooks on the Skyline Drive in Shenandoah National Park, for instance. The Swainson's thrush is another bird of the conifer forests of the far north, another one that goes all the way to South America. In the bulk of their population will winter there. A few of them winter in southern Central America, and this is another ground-dwelling bird. Most of our brown-spotted thrushes are ground-dwelling, and one of the things about forest interior ground-dwelling birds, they typically have very big eyes because they're living where there's not a lot of light coming in. The cerulean warbler is a canopy nester of deciduous forest that's fairly mature. Usually where there's a lot of oak trees, you'll find cerulean warblers. And curiously, they tend to form loose nesting colonies. You very rarely find just a single nesting pair of cerulean warblers. You can go through a lot of forests, not find any, and then you'll be in an area where, you're on a little dirt country road up on the ridges, and in the course of a quarter mile, there might be 4 or 5 nesting pair. I can't tell you why they have that colonial nature, but they seem to have it. And a little blue-gray gnatcatcher, another one that's a favorite of many people, high up in deciduous trees, and usually at the edge of the tree and at the edge of the forest as well. So an area where there's openings near the tree, and they forage out in the outer branches. And the rose-breasted grosbeak, one of our few finch family members that is a true neotropical migrant. Many of our finches are strictly temperate zone, and they are usually in moist to wet forests, but they do well in edges, and they do well around humans. They will come to bird feeders, and probably where we are here, certainly in Cape May, a lot more rose-breasted grosbeaks were seen at bird feeders this spring migration, because the spring, April, early May was so chilly, the insect bloom was late to come out, and so these birds found birdseed to be to their liking. And the black-throated green warbler, this is an interesting one. It's a mid-level feeder, usually in mixed conifer and deciduous woods. So it's more the northern part of the deciduous forest biome where you start to get more conifers, the mixed New England forest, and going somewhat up into the boreal forest. But it's got a curious distribution. If you look at the breeding area, you see it's up in the boreal, in the mixed New England forest, down through the Appalachians, down to the Great Smokies. And then there's this population on the mid-Atlantic coast. Once considered a separate subspecies that they called the Wayne's warbler, the coastal plain nesting black-throated green warblers, which are a little bit different size morphologically, a little different song, are usually in areas with mixed cypress as the conifer and deciduous. So our focus has been on neotropical migrant songbirds, but I do want to tip my cap that there are some neotropical migrants that are not songbirds. And here we'll play the guessing game again. Any idea what this bird would be? It's the semi-palmated sandpiper. Indeed, most of them will winter on coastal areas in tropical South America and Central America, and they are true Arctic breeders. How about this one? Going way, way south into South America to winter, and mostly breeding in the southern US, but there's a couple little spots you might see in North Carolina and one sort of on the Virginia-Maryland line, and this is a bird expanding its nesting range into the Northeast. Maybe climate change, I don't know. But it's one of our migratory raptors, the Mississippi kite. Population expanding, long distance migrant, feeds on larger flying insects, takes them on the wing, so grasshoppers and things like that. And they do show up in good numbers where there are cicada outbreaks. So be ready to look for Mississippi kites next year. Now here's another neotropical migrant songbird with a wide range in South America in the winter and a wide range in North America in the summer. It's our common nighthawk, another one that feeds on flying insects, but as the name implies, crepuscular or even nocturnal, eating a lot of moths, beetles, and other insects that it takes on the wings. And one more, really remarkable neotropical migrant non-songbird that we all love very much, our ruby-throated hummingbird. Really remarkable that many of these birds will migrate up to 2,000 miles each direction in migration. So one last question sometimes comes up, and that's neotropical migrants. Are they all going from the tropics into North America? No, there are some austral migrants that come from the tropical regions to and from the temperate zone of South America. But as this map we looked at earlier shows, there is really not very much land area in temperate South America, whereas there's quite a bit in temperate North America. So there are a few austral migrants, neotropical migrants going south, but not too many, and we don't have time to talk about them tonight, so that'll be the subject for maybe another talk. So we've looked at neotropical migrants, some of the interesting birds that are seen coming to or through mid-Atlantic regions each year in their migrations. And here are 6 more species that we didn't even get to. There's more birds we could be talking about, but I was asked to do an hour and my clock says it's 8:01. So I thank you all anyway.
Well, I'm sure everyone will join me in thanking you, Mark, so much for this talk. We really appreciate it, really enjoyed it. And thank you all for coming.